quite a topic here that probably 4 or 5 years ago wasn't on the agenda of most organizations in terms of their response to the global environment here. So we're seeing that the global supply chain is under a tremendous amount of stress. We've had pandemics, we have conflicts in Ukraine, now the Middle East, we've had tariffs, geopolitical tensions, we've got rising regulatory issues. Those are just to name the few, and they're all happening at the same time. And this has put a tremendous amount of stress on organizations, and they're viewing reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, or different types of regionalization to address a lot of the shocks that they have to the system right now. So from a macro perspective, Marion, let me start with you. Is nearshoring a permanent shift, or are we just responding to the noise that's in the marketplace today? How do you view nearshoring and this bringing back together, unwinding the global supply chain?
Well, first I want to maybe echo the point you make that until recently we wouldn't even have thought about these questions. So I represent an international organization, so not a private sector, but a government institution. I'm responsible for international trade, and the term resilience in supply chains was simply not a term we were looking into. That started to change during COVID-19. And then when in the early 20s we came up with a trade strategy that included work on supply chain resilience, that was considered, I have to say, revolutionary. So yes, it's a relatively new topic. My sense is that business was looking into this earlier on. You had with the tsunami in Japan, with the great financial crisis, those were already moments that triggered a different type of risk assessment. But for us, this was relatively new. When it comes to the term nearshoring, we do not focus on that term. What we focus on is looking at, if you are concerned about vulnerabilities, one source of vulnerability can be overexposure to a supplier or to a market. And if you want to reduce that overexposure, you want to diversify. Now, if in the past you were overexposed to a country that is far away, let's say China, and now you want to diversify to another supplier, let's say I'm in Europe, I diversify towards Morocco, then you end up nearshoring. But we do not consider the nearshoring, we don't treat it as an objective. The objective is diversification in order to enhance resilience.
So risk reduction and more on the financial side of it in terms of, the resilience, maintaining your business operations, not necessarily a strategic shift to deprioritize global supply chain.
That's definitely the way we analyze that question, and I think that is would be aligned with the way a company would look at the question. There's a cost of the disruption in supply chains. There is a cost of maintaining 2 production sites instead of 1. If the risk to the supply chain increases because there are more risks to, for instance, the Suez Canal being closed, then the trade-offs change, and then the decision-making will be affected by that. Where does the government come into the discussion? Governments do not necessarily pursue the same objectives as a company. So, for instance, I'm here with somebody representing the pharmaceutical sector. The pharmaceutical company doesn't necessarily look at where am I selling these pharmaceutics. The pharmaceutical company wants to produce with profit. The policymaker would want, in a moment of crisis, a medication to be available in the country or in the region that he or she represents. So there are moments where policymakers pursue an objective that is not fully aligned with what the company may want to do, and that's where government may want to have a say on the resilience strategy of the company, and where the 2 players, and that's our position, have to work together. Governments should not run supply chains.
Kate, Marion is pointing out that it's de-risking their supply chains. Does nearshoring actually de-risk or reduce the risk, or simply move it to a different location?
So, hi, everybody. Maybe just a quick background on Sandoz, because not everyone has heard of us. So Sandoz is the largest generic medicines manufacturer in the world. What a lot of people also don't know about generics is they make up about 80% of the medicines available worldwide, right? So most of us are taking generic drugs. Many of you are probably taking Sandoz products, especially if you live in Europe. Sandoz is based in Europe. We actually produce most of our medicines in Europe, which is fairly unique because so much of the supply chain has moved to Asia. So I would say we're facing two things. There's a push for us to become more sustainable, which I would say everyone here who either is based in Europe or has operations in Europe are getting the pressure from European governments to become more sustainable, to prove it. We're also being pushed to onshore some of our production of medicines because there is a security of supply issue. So for us, right now, China and India make up 80% of the ingredients that go into all antibiotics in the world, which is, a little bit scary if we think about potential geopolitical tensions with China, for example, right? So what we're facing is for all drug companies, if there is a supply disruption of the ingredients for our drugs, that means we can't make them, we can't sell them, right? Which leads to shortages. And so I think there's an interesting case to be made here for onshoring. I think we would call it onshoring, right? Or manufacturing as much in Europe as we can end to end in our supply chain. From a sustainability perspective, right? We can do a good job on sustainability as a European company with European suppliers. And also from a security of medicine supply perspective. So I think we can, it's not easy, but I think we can sort of kill two birds with one stone by trying to bring more of the supply chain of medicines production into Europe.
Interesting that you're pointing out that it's not only a de-risking, but it's a strategic initiative for the organization as well. My assumption is that there's increased costs associated with that challenge. Is that absorbed or is that passed on today?
I mean, in a way, the low costs for generic drugs is contributing to this problem, right? Part of the reason that everyone is buying their supply from China and India is because it's cheaper, right? And of course, and that's a very rational decision for companies to make. What that means, though, is that we've ended up in this place where everyone has done that. And so we're in a place where we're a bit exposed, right, if there is geopolitical tension. So I think from our perspective, that it's important that we communicate the value of security of medicines, right? We are talking all the time, especially now in Europe, and I always in the US, but we're talking all the time about national security, regional security. We don't talk about security of medicines as part of that narrative very much. And we probably should, because it might cause governments, who are, by the way, about 50% of our customers are government payers. It might cause them to value medicines more highly, right? And not say, we will only pay, most antibiotics in Europe, they cost less than a pack of gum or a cup of coffee. Right. And so for us, we would say, should we value life-saving antibiotics more than a pack of gum or a cup of coffee? Probably. I'm from Sandoz, so I'm saying that, right? But I think most people would say, yes, this is an important area for us to focus on, in addition to, sort of the classic defense arguments.
Yeah, and give us a little bit background on yours. For Volvo, you guys have always had distributed manufacturing. So give me a sense historically how this is viewed within Volvo right now.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the difference between you're talking about government, you're talking about final customers having their medicines. For us, is about delivering the machines or the trucks that are making the roads. Extracting things that we need and everything that is hard, software or hardware. Building schools, roads, and so on. So that we are providing infrastructure. And our sites are everywhere where our customers are needing our trucks and machines. So it means that it's US, it's in India, in China, and so on. And I totally agree with what you said. For us, it's not about nearshoring or low-cost sourcing or high-cost sourcing. It's about the resilience of the supply chain so that our customers get their machines and their trucks. So for me, the battle as the head of purchasing for global purchasing in Volvo Construction is to convince stakeholders that there's no shortcut like, we need to regionalize everything. Because would we have regionalized everything when COVID came, we would have no supply at all. Because if we would be depending only on China or only on Italy, then we would just shut down the factories. So for me, it's the equilibrium that you need to find in as a supply chain professional. Where do I secure, my sourcing? And of course, then there's a lot of elements on the sustainability part of it, the price of it, and so on. So, that's more the trade-off that you were talking about, is how do you make it safe? I think I forgot your question, actually.
Absolutely. So give me a sense. I mean, as you're sourcing from all over the world,
Yeah.
has your sourcing strategy changed, or is it responding to market dynamics?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the beauty of having a supply chain that is close to where you produce is the speed of development that you can have and the reactivity that you have. So I think that is more what is driving actually us to nearshore, is to make sure that you have a supply chain that is agile, responsive, and in sync with the market demand. Because when you are shipping and you have to cross the canal when it's open, when you have to cross it, it's a very long way. So you take 2-3 months to bring your parts to where you produce. This is not sustainable, especially if you take dirty ships, and it's even less when you fly over. And also the lead time is not good to be reactive with the market demand. So I would say it's more the market demand that pushes you to have first a resilient supply chain, but at the same time a very proactive and agile supply chain that is pushing to be as close as possible to where you produce. So that's more the business driver. So that from a sourcing strategy point of view, this is what is driving us to adapt and change. But there's also a lot of constraints with that, because if you want to produce and supply locally, it means that you also need to have the testing and the engineering locally. So that's one of the things I wanted to say, is that before that you had a global development with a global supplier and they were developing for you globally and shipping globally. If you want to do it in 5 different regions, then you multiply the size of the teams, because you need to develop 5 different suppliers in every place. And so there's a lot of things to consider in the cost, in the speed, and so on. So a lot of interesting things for the supply chain and purchasing professionals.
Since you've been in the regionalization for quite a while, one of the key aspects is the ecosystem necessary, as you're pointing out, whether engineering or labor or your suppliers. Yeah. Not every region has that resource.
Yeah.
So how did you overcome that? Because my assumption is that not every region had a perfect alignment of resource, technology, energy for your organization. How did you overcome that, or how do you develop that resource for the organization consistently?
Yeah, and you know about competencies, because that's your job, right? To develop purchasing and supply chain professional. If you look, and then we had this discussion during these 2 days, where is the most efficient industrial footprint in all the world, with the cheapest energy, with the most skilled people right now? You all know the answer. This is in China. They are the most efficient industrial footprint in the world. And this we have been contributing by, sourcing everything from China. And what is the situation now in Europe? We are trying to rebuild an industrial footprint that has been kind of drowned. In US, it's also the case. And so to bring back those competencies, and then the whole ecosystem is really, it's a big challenge, where I think the institution and the regulator needs to help us, because we talk about, incentive, we talk about raising money to actually reconstruct the whole ecosystem. But that is the challenge for us. So, yeah. And as a customer, we are here to help.
Yep. It's interesting. You point out that a shorter supply chain can increase compliance and perhaps transparency within the organization. Kate, are we actually improving the standards, or what's the compliance? You're manufacturing, again, in multi-regions. What do you comply to, a local standard or a global standard?
Depends which compliance regime you're talking about, right? I mean, from a sustainability and ESG perspective, Europe generally has the highest standards.
Yep.
And as a global company, we have decided we will comply globally with European standards, mostly because it's easier than picking, standards times 100 countries, right? So from a sustainability perspective, we know that we need to be as good as the Europeans are demanding that we be. Of course, we're following all the local regulations, right? But for us, I think what we're trying to do is also turn that to our advantage as a business, right? To say, listen, if we're producing products in Austria, for example, that we're selling in Europe, we're selling globally, but in this case, Europe, what does it mean that we're doing that, right? What does it mean that we have an end-to-end supply chain in Europe that's producing drugs that we're then shipping, less distance, right, than if we were shipping from China? What does it mean for costs, right, that we can do this? So there's a compliance argument, and of course we need to be compliant with the Europeans. The more interesting argument for me is the sales argument, right? Is that if we can say to the Norwegians, for example, who are demanding up to 30% of the points in Norwegian tenders for medicines are actually sustainability related. And so if I can give them all of the data that I have on why we're better than other companies at sustainability, then I can win those points and I can win the business, right? And so for me, there's a compliance angle, and also for us increasingly, as especially Europeans are demanding it, we're making that sort of part of our sales pitch, is to say, look, we are more sustainable than, or as sustainable as the next company.
Let's dig into that a little bit more on green regionalization in terms of, the compliance.
Yep.
Is it real strategy, or is it a political narrative today in terms of actual impact? Because we've seen a lot of the, sort of the proclamations and the noise or the statements about, sustainability and decarbonization. We don't see it as much on the corporate reports now. Companies are still focused on it, but we tend not to see it as visible as before. Give me a sense of how Sandoz views that.
Yeah, I think probably depends on how much exposure you have to the U.S., right? Because of course the U.S. has been the big pusher away from sustainability, from DEI, et cetera, as of late. Companies that are operating in Europe, even if they're U.S. companies, if they have large enough, footprint in Europe, they're doing a good job on sustainability reporting because they have to. And so that's actually not changing much. We released our report last week. We're, full speed ahead on sustainability reporting. So I think as much as we're talking about the politics, and I'm American living in Europe, and, as much as we're paying attention to the noise out of the US, I haven't seen any companies, certainly in pharma, that are pulling back on their sustainability commitments. Maybe they're less noisy. Maybe they're not on the front page of the report. I haven't seen a lot of change. Interested to hear from the rest of the group, but I think that there has been a bit of change in how we communicate, not much change in how we operate. And I think that is especially because there's a business reason for us to do this work.
Yep. Marion, let's dig into that a little bit more on the climate goals and, the geopolitical resilience that organizations are trying to develop. Are there trade-offs between the emissions and, the tracking and security that organizations are looking for? I mean, we're trying to control our supply chains, as Kate is pointing out, as much as possible. Is there a trade-off between controlling your supply chain and the green goals or the climate goals that we have today?
I don't think there are trade-offs. One thing they have in common is that for both objectives, you require probably quite a high level of traceability. You have to be able to show where products come from, and I'm thinking notably of goods that have potentially dual-use technology. That would be the case in the automobile sector. You maybe have to show where something comes from, and you may have to show how it has been produced if you want to give information on sustainability. So there you need a system that allows you to trace that information through the supply chain, and that information has to be recognized at every border you cross. And if you do this digitally, then you need also the software, the digital software, to speak to each other. So these things could now be developed together, and yet you carry the different pieces of information through the supply chain. Another aspect we are seeing is that there are sometimes considerations that some countries are like-minded when it comes to their security concerns and like-minded when it comes to their environmental sustainability concerns. I'm not so certain about that. I'm convinced that a country like China, for instance, is very serious about pursuing environmental sustainability goals, and they are in a number of areas very advanced in this. What I would like, however, to recall is that the entire entire aspect of standardization around sustainability, for instance, also has geoeconomic aspects. Because it's relatively easy to say, oh, your standard doesn't meet mine. It's different. I don't recognize this. Once upon a time, for instance, Europeans didn't import Japanese cars because there were explosive engines in those cars. And that explosive engine was the airbag. And that lasted as long as the European car makers were not able to produce the airbag themselves. So standards around sustainability, notably, can also play a role in the geoeconomic developments we are currently seeing.
Let's go back about 5 years. Not that I want to, but in supply chain terms, it's probably 100 years in terms of the impact that it's had. One of the causes, or one of the the outcomes of the pandemic, was that we were gapped in a number of areas in the supply chain, predominantly visibility. And we did not have visibility beyond tier 1 in our supply chains, where most of the disruption occurred in tier 2 and beyond. As we're focusing more on specifically on that regionalization and on visibility of your extended supply chain, do you have complete visibility into your extended supply chain today?
So I think no one has complete visibility of its full supply chain. I never seen that in any industry, but maybe. So the visibility on our first suppliers, 2,200 suppliers for my business, but then you can multiply by 2 and 5 and 10 and so on. And then you realize, oh, there's a supplier, by the way, carbon black is coming from Russia. So then everybody realize, oh, my tires are black because the carbon black is coming from Russia. Otherwise, tires would be white. So these kind of things, but what we know is that our first tier, they know to who they buy. And the one to who they buy, they know to who they buy, obviously. So I think the transparency is not for us as the customer, but it's the supply chain has visibility of what is coming. Back to the traceability, now we are calculating for every single parts that we purchase the CO2 footprint of those parts. And by the way, the EU is asking us to define what is the complete bill of material, what is the content of every single material that you have in your bill of material. So bill of material is all the components you put into the machines. So anyway, we had to put in place traceability to understand what's inside. And thanks to that, we can actually also calculate, together with our supplier base, the carbon footprint. First tier will tell us what is the carbon footprint they have in every single part, but they will have to get it also from their suppliers and so on. So transparency at my level and my colleagues' level on the full supply chain, no. There's a lot of vendors who are pretending they can, well, let's not be bad and say pretending, but they say, or they sell that they can show you the full supply chain. I didn't see something really realistic for the time being. But the players, they know what's happening, and this is progressing. I think we get better and better control and visibility of what do we purchase, what do they purchase, and what does it mean for our final customer. Yeah.
It's interesting. We talk to a lot of supply chain professionals, and one of the things they say that we no longer can go and say is that we don't know who and what is in our supply chain. So good news is we should have theoretically, had as much visibility as possible. So that's the good news. Yeah. The bad news is that we now know who and what is in our supply chain, and we're finding out that we're not as resilient, we're not as agile, and we're not as sustainable. And that requires a response because now you know. And so back to the traceability in terms of the resources and the raw materials. Have there been structural changes because of the visibility that you've gained?
Yeah, but I think we better know and then act. So at the end of the day, it's the same for sustainability matters. You need to know so that you can act. You need to be a player and an actor of the transformation about what we are looking at and what we want to reach. So I'm quite happy we have better visibility rather than, you don't know from where you're buying. It doesn't make sense, even from a security point of view and for the final customer at the end of the day. So, yeah.
Kate, let me throw this to you because you brought up a comment before about China and their oversized role, not only in supply chain, but in medicine. I think you quoted 80+% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients come from India or China. And so there's a choke point over there to talk about visibility. I'm not sure how many people realize how much dependency we have on India and China for those active pharmaceutical ingredients. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and actually COVID was a good example of that. Obviously when China shut down, right, and during COVID, that meant that hundreds of API factories shut down, right? So they stopped work. They did not ship us the API that we needed to make our antibiotics. And so there were shortages of antibiotics during COVID, which of course is exactly not when you want a shortage of antibiotics, when people are getting pneumonia. And so that was, I think, a bit of a wake-up call to the industry, to partly to realize how concentrated we were in suppliers, right? Because you don't necessarily know who your competitors' suppliers are, right? Maybe you don't even know who your own suppliers are. Enough levels down the chain, you don't necessarily know if one supplier is supplying the whole industry, right? So I think that was a wake-up call for us. And again, it is an issue where, and I'll talk about Europe, but U.S. is the same. We need to decide how much we value the security of the supply chain, right? If you're spending, $5 on a package of antibiotics, and we can't change the price for 5 years, no matter how much the inputs increase for us, right? So it's a commodity, but it's not, right? Because we can't actually float based on our inputs. Then that means that we're making choices, right, to try to make some margin on those products, which usually means going to cheaper countries, right? And the countries that, it's not just cheaper, right? China also has a great supply chain for us, right? They make good stuff, high quality, cheaper than we can make it, right? And so there's, again, super rational decisions based on the price points that we're selling, right? And so, and I would say this is actually changing a bit with sustainability. You mentioned, for one of your trucks, you need to be able to provide the carbon footprint or the bill of materials. That's happening to us for one pack of pills. So our customers, our European customers are saying, one pack of pills in a box, right? Antibiotics. You guys need to tell us the carbon footprint of this pack of pills. And, the question, of course, is, what are you going to do with this information? And so far the answer is we're just gathering for now, right? We're learning. But that also is adding additional costs for us, right? Because we want to do the work. It's not that easy. We don't have these perfect AI systems that go all the way into our supply chains that can tell us exactly what is the product carbon footprint. And so that's another thing where it's the right thing to do. We want to be able to sort of participate in this. We want to be able to win new business because we're good at it. It is an additional cost, right? And so if I'm talking about a $5, pack of pills, and the product carbon footprint costs me $50,000, right? Then some of that is considerations that we need to take into account when we're pricing.
Dig into this a little bit more, because let's focus not only on the choke points. Obviously, China and India are oversized relative to that, but distribution. And during COVID, we saw uneven distribution because of the cold chain and because of inaccessibility. We're sort of out of balance relative to accessibility of opioids. For example, Canada has probably 1,000 times more than they need, while sub-Saharan Africa has 1,000 less than they need. How do you rebalance, or how do you focus on that availability and accessibility at the same time?
Yeah, it's a bit of a pricing issue, of course, right? We're still a for-profit company. We still need to be able to sell our medicines at some sort of margin. It's also a supply chain issue, like you said, right? We need Sandoz, we don't have the deep networks in Africa, for example, that some of the Indian and Chinese pharmaceutical companies might have, right? They've got a lot more distribution, and of course, then that means they can work at scale. One of the things we do focus on, actually, with accessibility in emerging markets is also quality. There's a lot, and it's not that Indian and Chinese companies are not providing high quality drugs. It's that there's a lot of counterfeiting. There's a lot of worry from patients, that if they're not buying a European product for whatever reason, that they might not be getting a high quality product, right? And so there's a lot that we focus on to make sure that we're super careful about counterfeits, working with the industry to push there. So I think it's a bit of it's again a supply chain issue in emerging markets, and also a cost issue for us.
Yep. Marion, OECD countries with localized strategic supply chains, what happens to developing economies when we're moving, more towards that centralized, regionalization, and where countries had they focused on export as opposed to, they provide the raw materials, and now we're moving away from, the globalization and resourcing from, far and wide to much more local if it's available. What happens are we leaving economies and countries behind? How do we address that?
Well, I'm not sure to which extent we already see this nearshoring and regionalization in the data. So until recently, I know that we saw that the distance traveled of everything going into a final good was increasing. With maybe some shocks in between during parts of COVID, but we do not see a radical nearshoring or regionalization in the data yet. So there is maybe more talk about it than we are currently seeing. That doesn't exclude that it may happen as a result of policies that are currently put in place. We in the OECD there is a lot of discussions about increasing the resilience of supply chains. And as I said, this takes rather the form of talking about resilience. Now, one challenge is that increasing resilience, if you do this by moving into something that is not necessarily profitable for the company, like I would like to have more ingredients for an antibiotic being produced in Europe or in the United States. That's costly. How do I finance this? The governments may be willing to support this, but they need to understand how the supply chain functions because they need to know which price to put against this. In order to move in this direction, you need a level of collaboration between the public and the private sector and a level of transparency in terms of data exchange that is hard to achieve in most supply chains. This was achieved to a certain extent after the great financial crisis in the banking sector, when resilience strategies were set up. There's a long tradition of having that kind of transparency in the agricultural sector, because food security has been on policymakers' radar screen forever. Now, so it's again to say, yes, OECD members are looking into this very seriously. Yes, we are analyzing this. Yes, we are bringing governments together. Yes, we are bringing governments and the private sector together. So far, this has not led to a massive nearshoring. Well, you're asking about emerging economies. Emerging economies, depending on where they are part of these discussions in different ways. For a number of critical supply chains, for instance, African or Asian or Latin American countries have the critical raw materials. So there is a high interest in dealing, in trading with these countries and having access to their raw materials. But yes, the negotiations are different, the discussions are different than they were 20 years ago.
Yep. But no country is self-sufficient. There isn't one country in the world that has everything that it needs for its population. So as we're taking a look at this uneven, demand of what is in our national interest, again, depending on where you sit, in the U.S. right now, it's chips and EV batteries as our national interest and our national security. You go to the Middle East, it's food. Are we creating an imbalance in terms of what is what for the global good as opposed to the regional good? And are we, bifurcating the world now in terms of the haves and the have-nots?
Maybe the discussion is potentially sounds more radical than what is currently going on. We currently have the situation that was described in several sectors. 80 or 90% of the ingredient comes from one country. Yeah. For certain critical raw materials for the car industry, rare earths, if one country, China, decides not to export those products anymore, entire supply chains are blocked. So currently we are most governments try to move away from their critical supply chains, try to move away from a situation where they are completely dependent on one supplier. No. And that doesn't mean becoming autarkic. No. That means for a number of supply chains, diversify more. And that process is not terribly rapid.
No.
I think that's what we heard.
Practically impossible to go that fast. when you're looking for critical minerals or rare earth material, who is ready to open mines in Spain or in France for lithium? Anyone, any candidate who wants to take this project? You will have fun. So, and the EU is asking us now to take 10 to 15% of critical materials in Europe, where there's no mines, and opening a mine takes 10 to 20 years. So we will still have those dependencies on the best in class to produce. China, Africa, refining lithium is all in China, 80% of it. So we cannot nearshore again. We cannot nearshore from one day to another one.
And that's maybe a good point. Going back to your earlier question, is there potentially tension between sustainability and security when it comes to opening up and locally mining projects or refining projects? There's a tension potentially.
Yeah.
When we talk about regionalization, let's use a real-life example. The U.S. Chips. We poured billions of dollars into a chip factory outside Arizona right now that started construction in 2021. First chip hasn't rolled off the factory floor yet. The workers are from Taiwan because we do not have the ecosystem or the talent necessary. The latest generation chip won't come off the factory until 2028.
Of course.
Planning horizons are, depending on the industry, are extended versus short. Your planning horizons are much longer term than, especially for the industrial equipment. Has your planning horizons changed because of the geopolitical issues and a lot of the disruptions?
Well, the fact that the context is changing more often and more drastically is the change that we need to adapt to. Because, as you said, 10 years ago, planning was planning.
No.
And, everybody has a plan. That was the famous American philosopher Mike Tyson who said that, right? Everybody has a plan until he gets punched in his face. So this is not existing anymore, right? So that's back to the agility question that we were talking about. Those kind of strategic move from TSMC, I think, is doing this factory, I guess, the Taiwanese company. This will be very difficult to follow at the speed that is required, because they will always retain their knowledge in Taiwan.
No.
Otherwise, they just lose their supremacy, and they call it the cheap shield. It means that if you start to annoy Taiwan, they would bomb all their factories. So that they need to get this knowledge, like we were doing when we were transferring knowledge to China. Alstom, Bombardier, Airbus, and so on, was really careful of what do you transfer there, what do you keep, and so on, because that's the way you kind of maneuver within the negotiation. So the horizon has changed in the fact that we need to adapt as fast as possible, but you cannot completely change your footprint, because from one day to another one, then something changed in the trades, or you would move factory to another place in one day. It's really not possible. So we are having fun.
Can I build on that?
The way on that, Kate.
And this is for medicines, but I assume it probably applies to Bobo too. I think there's a few roles that government can play here, right? They can, of course, make policy, right? That is friendlier to made in Europe, for example, right? Make it cheaper, make it easier. They can provide financing, right? So fine, if you want us to build a factory in Europe that could make more penicillins, help us finance it. And then the government as customer and as payer. Certainly for pharma, like I said, there's 50% of our business in Europe is government. And so government procurement could change, to incentivize things like made in Europe, if they care about sustainability, incentivize sustainability, right? So I think there's these three roles. That's obviously the regulatory, the classic, financing, and procurement, I think could help to start to move, not quickly, right, but could start to move it in the right direction.
Let's pick a question off the floor here. It says, will moving away from dependency on other countries result in less global cooperations if countries no longer have anything to gain from aligning with each other? So we're in a much more multipolar world as opposed to a globalized supply chain. Marion, why don't you see if we can address that.
Yeah, so I worked before working for the OECD, for the World Trade Organization for many years, and we did indeed believe that trade is also important for peace. An example, a beautiful example, is that International Chamber of Commerce. It was actually created after the First World War with the title Merchants for Peace. So this idea of trading with each other, creating relationships, and this is good for peace, it is a long-standing idea. In my home country, Germany, we had another related slogan, Wandel durch Handel. Countries will change and become more like us, I guess, if we trade with them. Well, it's considered that it didn't work. Now, as a director responsible for trade, I definitely think that we should continue to trade with each other, and I hope that those connections contribute to a peaceful being with each other. But this strong optimism that existed still a decade ago, maybe it has been a bit shaken. So now we have to build that back again and work together on building trusted relationships.
More often than not, though, but nearshoring and reshoring is sold as jobs creation because, it's our population. We're going to bring back manufacturing. We can pound on the table. What kind of jobs are coming back, or what kind of jobs are needed? Are we looking at a different labor pool today than we saw perhaps 5 or 10 years ago? Jan.
Skills, and you're in the skills industry, so skills are changing for all professionals all around the world. I don't think we have differences in China, India, and whatsoever. And from a supply chain point of view, I'm very impressed by the progress. We talked about this before, but there's more and more schools who are preparing professional. At my time, you were either business or engineering. I was both, but there was maybe 5 institutions in the world preparing professionals. So from a purchasing and supply chain professional, I think we have really skilled students. I'm myself an honorary teacher in a business school for supply chain master. I see the level is really good. What is missing is the speed of incubating the new knowledge necessary now. Mm-hmm. On AI, for example, I think we are lagging behind. On new ways of working to develop things faster. I think we can take the best of the best. Back to those teams, you have excellent practices in China, excellent practices in Germany, in France, in US. If you look at your teams, when you're in a global company, to be honest, you have the best applications everywhere. If you bring that together, that makes you the best company in the world. You don't have those guys work better, those guys work better. No, that's not the way. They work great. Take the greatest there, bring it to the greatest there, and then change and have a mindset that is a growth mindset that helps you to incubate all of this diversity. And that's how you become the best in the world. That's truly what we believe in Volvo, is inclusiveness and diversity will bring you the best of the best, not segregating and saying, they do well, they do bad, and so on. So, for example, if you develop a global purchasing organization and you end up with having teams in China that operate completely differently than the other one in Sweden, you sub-optimize the knowledge. So that's not the right way to approach it. So yes, local adaptation, and then take the best of the best and then use it for a common platform of knowledge. So I think that's the way to approach it and take the benefits.
Okay, you built your team up when you took on this role here. Are there competencies or capabilities that you were looking for on the talent side that made them the employee? What are you looking for? What should organizations be looking for in capabilities today?
From an ESG and sustainability perspective specifically, I would say we believe it's a bit easier to teach ESG than to teach accounting, for example, or to teach procurement. And so we actually kind of were biased toward, for our ESG reporting team, let's hire a whole bunch of accountants who know what financial reporting is supposed to look like, because we know we're going to have to be as good at ESG reporting as we are financial reporting in a couple of years, right? So I said, we can teach the ESG stuff, it's fine. I can't teach the financial accounting stuff, right? And so same with procurement. I want the guy who's been buying paperboard and packaging for 20 years, right? Because he really knows how to do that. I want him to understand where we're coming from when we say, shave 20% off the weight of this paperboard because we can save money, make our customers happy, win new business, right? So I would say we really have been biased toward picking an expert and teaching ESG as opposed to hiring ESG people. I'm also glad that this is now sort of an industry. It's in and of itself, ESG and sustainability. But I think it's really important to find the experts in the business and bring them onto our side, I would say, yeah.
Marion, let me take you on a different road here. 5 years in the future, we're no longer dealing with a lot of the regionalization discussions and the geopolitical issues. Are we moving more towards a globalized world, or are we now permanently in this regionalized multipolar world?
I have to be optimistic here because that's it's my job. I hope that we come out of this multiple crisis situations that we have been going through stronger, and that we find a way to design policy and run supply chains that is both sustainable and resilient. And for this, we need to build a different level, a new level of trust, notably at the policymakers, at the government level. I'm not sure whether 5 years is enough, but I would like to hope that it's the case.
Final question, and I'm going to give you a choice. You can choose one priority: climate decarbonization, geopolitical resiliency, or cost competitiveness. Yeah.
We say in Volvo that being sustainable is not a nice to have; it's the license to operate. So if you're looking at midterm, long term, and we continue with our commitment to the Science-Based Target Initiative, the Paris Agreement, and so on, and we will be 2040 zero emission. And when you're thinking about our machines are mostly diesel, they emit 150 million tons per year. We take the responsibility for that. So it's if you think short term, you have to adapt to what is happening with the context. Then it's the answer to yes, we need to be cost efficient. We need to survive as a company for our customers. But midterm, long term, this is straightforward. We will not compromise to the sustainability goals, because that's the way to survive. Yeah.
Kate, I have a guess as to how you're going to respond. Decarbonization, geopolitical resilience, or cost competitiveness?
I think I might say geopolitical resilience, actually. I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking.
No.
Look, and of course, it's all related,
Yeah.
of course, right? We need to be able to be sustainable for the long term. Right. We need to be able to be competitive, cost competitive for the long term. So if I could just say resilient, right? That's probably what I'd choose. I don't think you can separate the three anymore. Maybe you never could. But for us, they're really interwoven.
Yep. Marion?
I think I come from the policymaker side, right? So I think as a company in the future, you will have to do all three together. But I think it's important that the financial sector rewards this. So that means that if Volvo and Sandoz invest in something where they see the return only in 5 years, that will need to be taken into account by the financial sector. And maybe that's where some rethinking has to take place.
Jan, one recommendations for the audience going back. What should they pay attention to at a macro level in terms of their focus on regionalization? Because if we pay attention to the news every day, we'd never get our jobs done.
Yeah, so that's a little bit back to what I said before. There is no black and white answer to the right supply chain setup. And I think that when you have your stakeholders who are telling you, we need to regionalize everything, based on what? We need to have the right suppliers at the right place to deliver the right parts at the right place. That's all what we need, in a way that it is sustainable and that it is resilient in the long term. So for me, the advice is don't let people who don't know what they talk to you about what you know the best. Because and it's a lot of communication, right? We say 80% of the purchasing work is internal. It's not the suppliers they're great. The most of the work that we have to do is transform internally the mindset, educate, make people understand. The good thing, sorry to say the good thing, but when the supply chain stopped all over the world, suddenly business realized, supply chain is something important. Oh yeah, no parts, no business, nothing. Yeah, right. So same, no medicine, nothing. So for us in purchasing professional, I think it's a really a golden area now. We are sitting at the table of the board because it's like between 30 to 70% of the total knowledge and innovation is coming from the network and the supplier. So no shortcuts. That would be my advice.
Okay, you guys deal with life sciences. These are life critical decisions for the organization. So there's a higher calling that you generally have. How does that influence the decision making within the organization relative to cost competitiveness and regionalization and some of the challenges on sourcing and manufacturing today?
You know, part of working for a company that has a really strong mission, right, pioneering access for patients, means that sometimes people say, just the core business is good enough, right? You know, we don't need to do anything else. We're doing God's work here. We're selling drugs to people for cheaper. And so I think for me, the challenge often is, okay, it's great. We're running a great company here. We're saving people's lives, right? However, can we do a little innovation here, right? What can I show you by making a package 20% smaller that I can save you money, make our pharmacists happy, right? You know, so let's not just rest on our laurels of feeling like we're a good company, right? Let's continue to push on the areas where we can improve.
Marion, last word. Give me some optimism in looking.
Okay.
No, I don't have optimism because I think Jan's point, I like Jan's point, don't take shortcuts, think yourself. But with all the technologies around and all the data around, we humans still seem to think only one direction and one variable. And that's why we tend to swing from one extreme to the other. So let's find that golden middle ground. And unfortunately, we have to think a lot around trade-offs, as you mentioned at the beginning. And it's going to be challenging, but take the challenge, be courageous, and go for it. And we'll make it work.
Thank you very much. I'd like to get this panel together in about 3 to 5 years and assess where are we today versus where we're going to be. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
and
you.
thank you all.
Thank you.